This video will focus on new Viking discoveries and information from the recent past. The largest ever study of Viking DNA has yielded some interesting and surprising results. The paper, called Population Genomics of the Viking World by Eske Willerslev and colleagues, features in the journal Nature and reveals that not all Viking DNA is from Scandinavia. Before I go into specifics, the central finding appears to be that Vikings absorbed as much DNA or more than they left behind, but the science of Viking genetics is complicated. My own DNA shows 9% from Scandinavia, but on the basis of the same test, this has fluctuated and shown different modern-day countries as the origin for my Nordic DNA. My family is from the area around Stamford in Lincolnshire, which was one of the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw, territory in England ceded to the Norsemen by the Anglo-Saxons, so the presence of Scandinavian DNA is not surprising. But the complicated thing, and potentially why my own sample keeps changing, is that the DNA of the Anglo-Saxons and the Danes or Vikings is virtually identical, because they originated from the same place and were simply different waves of invasion and conquest of what is now England. However, the findings of the new study muddy the waters even further and show not only the genetic imprint of the Norse, but their cultural legacy also. The paper's abstract read, "The maritime expansion of Scandinavian populations during the Viking Age, about AD 750 to 1050, was a far-flung transformation in world history. Here we sequence the genomes of 442 humans from archaeological sites across Europe and Greenland to understand the global influence of this expansion. We find the Viking period involved gene flow into Scandinavia from the south and east. We observe genetic structure within Scandinavia, with diversity hotspots in the south and restricted gene flow within Scandinavia. We find evidence for a major influx of Danish ancestry into England, a Swedish influx into the Baltic, and Norwegian influx into Ireland, Iceland and Greenland. Additionally, we see substantial ancestry from elsewhere in Europe entering Scandinavia during the Viking Age. Our ancient DNA analysis also revealed that a Viking expedition included close family members. The new study also reveals that generally Vikings were a lot more genetically diverse than the peasant societies on the Scandinavian mainland. The Vikings lived in coastal areas and, genetically speaking, they were an entirely different people to the peasant societies living further inland, said co-author Ashot Margarian. Also, commenting on the culture the Vikings exported, Eske Willerslev said, "In Scotland there's a grave which in archaeological terms would be classified as a Viking grave. Its swords and symbols reflect the Viking culture. However, genetically speaking, the man in the grave has nothing in common with the Vikings. He is an example of how the Viking culture was embraced in certain places." The article also noted, within the British Isles it's difficult to assess how much of the Danish-like ancestry is due to pre-existing Anglo-Saxon ancestry, but the Viking Age contribution does not exceed 6% in England. The genetic effects are stronger in the other direction. So, who conquered who? It is well known that the Vikings assimilated and intermarried with locals when they settled. The Normans are a prime example of that. But the findings of this research highlight just how much interchange there was between the Vikings and the peoples of the areas they raided. Time to strap in for a bit of controversy. Fascinating new research into the increasing use of home DNA testing kits has revealed that those claiming Viking DNA could foster unhealthy ideas of genetic predeterminism. The study, called I Am a Viking, DNA, Popular Culture and the Construction of Geneticized Identity, published in the journal New Genetics and Society, Critical Studies of Contemporary Biosciences, was conducted by Sweden-based academics Anna Korlund of Stockholm University and Daniel Strand of Uppsala University. The paper's abstract read, "In this article we analyse how genetic genealogy reshapes popular notions of historical identity as it facilitates a genetically informed understanding of ethnicity and ancestry. Drawing on interviews with Swedish, British and American individuals who have employed genetic ancestry tests, GATs, to provide ancestral connections to Vikings, we explore how the desire to be a Viking is articulated through a convergence of pre-existing discourses around Vikings and DNA. By combining signs for genetic science and popular depictions of Vikings, our interviewees create a new discourse of geneticized Viking identity. In this new discourse, socio-historically constructed ideas about Vikings are naturalized as the innate qualities of individuals who possess a certain genetic composition. Images of the Viking, once created for political, cultural, or commercial purposes, are revived in new embodied forms and can start to circulate in new social contexts where they, by association, appear to be confirmed by genetical science. Anna Corlin expanded on the theme in an article in The Conversation, where she mentioned the unhealthy obsession with so-called Viking DNA and its social consequences. She wrote, "In our new study, we carried out interviews with people from the US, the UK and Sweden who had purchased genetic ancestry tests to see if they were related to Vikings. Since the test results did not include the term Viking, most of them pointed to the category Scandinavia in their ethnic charts as proof of having Viking ancestry. Almost all of the people in our study saw their results as scientific confirmation of either being related to Vikings or of actually being a Viking. As a man from the US put it, the results began to confirm or at least lay the basis for the person that I am. In a similar way, a woman from Sweden said that her test allowed her to know who I am and what my origins are. However, what the tests actually proved was based on creative interpretation. In this sense, several of our interviewees took images of the Viking, fostered in popular culture and political propaganda, and used them to make sense of their own lives. She added, for example, people with experiences of violence and abuse use their Viking genes as explanation, describing Vikings as warriors and berserkers. Knowing that I am descended from Vikings, a man from the US said, has made it clearer to me why there might be a genetic preponderance to violence and explosive anger in my family. In a similar way, interviewees who considered themselves to be restless described the Vikings as explorers and naval engineers. A woman from the US said, I have to see new lands, adding that it was due to the Viking in her. The academic said that it seemed that the use of genetic ancestry tests can facilitate a kind of genetic determinism in which a person's life is the natural result of their genome. She said, from this perspective, humans appear not to have much control over their lives. By dividing people into racial or national categories, genetic ancestry tests might be used to trigger tensions between different groups. Even if a person's Viking DNA only amounts to a small amount, it can still provide an allegedly scientific basis for racial division. She concluded, in an era marked by increasing xenophobia and ethnic chauvinism, it is important to be aware of the interplay between genetics and ideas about race. On a personal note, I know I was pleased to find a reasonable amount of Scandinavian DNA in my own ancestry DNA results, and I did automatically assume Viking lineage. So, is this just a harmless piece of fun and general historical interest, or could it have a darker side? An interesting article appeared in the British magazine The Spectator this week, which made the claim that Vikings were winning the culture war. For those unfamiliar with the publication, The Spectator is the oldest English language magazine in the world and is often at the leading edge of national and international political and cultural conversations. So this article is meaningful in terms of where the Norse raiders currently are in the cultural zeitgeist. In the article, author Ed West reproduced one of his Substack posts where he looked at the modern obsession with the Northmen and sought to explain why this was happening. Links to the Spectator article and Substack page are in the description below. So what did the article say? Well, Mr. West begins by recounting the horrific treatment of a sacrifice victim as reported to his masters at the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad by the Arabic diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan from the year 922. This is to presumably demonstrate the brutality and backwardness of these northern European pagans in contrast with the monotheistic Muslims of the Arab world at the time. This theme continues throughout when the Norse are contrasted with Anglo-Saxon and Frankish Christians, although the author does allow himself to criticise Charlemagne for his hypocritical promiscuity and, more notably, brutality in converting the Germanic peoples at the point of a sword. There is no mention of the outrage of the destruction of the continental Saxon sacred Irminsul tree by the Holy Roman Emperor's forces during the Saxon Wars, though. He cites Robert Eggers's fantastic and bloody new revenge epic, The Northman, as an example of the gratuitous violence and ritual murder that was a feature of Scandinavian society at this time, which reflects the account Ibn Fadlan made. So why does Mr. West believe Vikings are winning the culture war? Two main themes are at the root of his contention: modern-day attitudes to sex and TV and movie audiences' seemingly voracious appetite for Viking-based content. Writing about the allure of Christianity and the Viking defeat in the original medieval culture war, West wrote, Being linked to a wider European civilization and far more literate had immense advantages and would win, despite their belief in peace and male sexual restraint being so weirdly counterintuitive. The losing polytheists had their worldview confined to history as Christianity swept across Scandinavia. Yet today the Norsemen, or Vikings, a historically imperfect but impossibly attractive term, are themselves embroiled in a new culture war, and this time they might win from beyond the grave. He continued, the Northman is part of a wider Viking cultural renaissance of recent years, with The Last Kingdom, the adaptation of Bernard Cornwell's book series, the Netflix show Vikings, as well as 3 Thor films, a 4th coming out this summer. Where Mr. West believes sex has a role in this new phenomenon is in the apparently free and easy attitude the Norse had in this regard. He contrasted this with traditional Victorian values which harked back to the alleged morality of Alfred the Great of Wessex. He wrote, the fact that Alfred was tormented by sexual desires which he prayed to God to free him from made him all the more virtuous and relatable to Victorians. He was a hero for a pre-ironic age. Today, such an internal sexual struggle is looked down upon, seen as unhealthy and hypocritical, positively weird. English nationalism is worthy of the thralls. To prove the Norse were sexually laissez-faire, he wrote, the behaviour of Freya, the goddess who represented womanhood in Norse mythology, is illustrative. She took many lovers and is said to have slept with every elf in Asgard without any sense of shame. To many post-Christians, there is huge attraction to such a society. Sympathetic historians point out the prejudices of sexually frustrated medieval monks whose lack of a healthy outlet resulted in lurid fantasies about pagan behaviour as well as misogyny. But is Freya really the benchmark upon which Norse women should be judged? I think not, and there is little real substance to the notion of the freewheeling, bed-hopping, town-raiding shield maiden. On the occasions when women did accompany men on raids, they were unlikely to be involved in any of the fighting and would have been restricted to provisioning the warriors or, potentially, performing rituals and magic to aid the menfolk. And does ubiquity really represent victory? The Northman faced a barrage of criticism from those on the left for its realistic portrayal of gender roles in Norse society and its historically accurate casting choices which only featured white actors. The same cannot be said of TV shows like Vikings, the spin-off Vikings Valhalla, and The Last Kingdom, which have featured a number of female warrior characters and more diverse casting. So are Vikings really winning the culture war, or have they been subsumed and conquered by it? Furthermore, it is bizarre to use the Marvel franchise's Thor films as evidence of a Viking victory in the so-called culture war. There are many things one can say about these, but that they are a fair and accurate portrayal of Norse society is not one of them. Yes, nominally Viking-connected content is currently popular, but if these shows and films are inaccurate caricatures of the real history, often with the addition of plot themes based on modern-day social issues, is this really a win for them? I suppose there is a chance that after watching some of these shows, people may seek out the Eddas or study the history of the Vikings and their precursor Bronze Age traditions. And it is certainly true that books on Vikings are also popular, but these are sometimes fairly revisionist efforts aiming to amp up controversial new theories to ensure often sensationalist media coverage and generate book sales. I think, in reality, Norse history and mythology is a rich source of story and intrigue for unimaginative TV and movie execs to plunder. It is the Vikings who are now being raided, and that doesn't sound like a victory to me. Brutal blood eagle method of ritual execution attributed to the Vikings was actually possible, a new study has found. The immensely unpleasant process was, according to legend, reserved for worst enemies and involved carving the victim's back open and hacking their ribs away from the spine and pulling the lungs through wounds to form a twisted and gory bird-like visage. The lungs splaying was said to have looked like wings, which lent this horrific practice its name, but it has long been a matter of conjecture whether the execution method was real history or Skaldic scuttlebutt. Questions over the attestations have, perhaps unsurprisingly, not stopped TV and movie producers from portraying the act, with representations appearing in films like horror flick Midsommar and History Channel series Vikings. One such victim of the Blood Eagle was the Anglo-Saxon king of Northumbria, Ayla, although no archaeological evidence of the ritual has ever been found, and the Norse at the time kept no written records, relying on oral traditions. Their history was only codified much later in poetry and sagas, penned long after the Northmen had abandoned their pagan past in favour of Christianity. In fact, this move to a new religion has been posited as the reason for the continued presence of the blood eagle in the tales of the Vikings. Historians have long suggested that it was a figment of Christian writers' imagination, designed to paint their pagan forebears as bloodthirsty savages before their civilization and embrace of the good book. But a new study points to it actually being possible. A team of researchers from the University of Iceland and the UK's Keele University determined that the practice was at least anatomically achievable. The team, made up of medical scientists and a historian, bypassed the long-standing question of did the blood eagle ever really happen, instead asking, could it have been done? They said that their answer was a clear yes. Previous scholarship of the blood eagle has only ever focused on the details of medieval textual accounts of the torture, with long-running debates concentrating on the exact terms used to describe the cutting or carving of the eagle into the victim's back. A widely held position is that the whole phenomenon is a misunderstanding of some complicated poetry, not something that could have actually been attempted. Using modern knowledge of anatomy and physiology, alongside painstaking reassessment of the 9 medieval accounts of the ritual, the team investigated what effect a blood eagle would have on the human body. What they found was the procedure itself would be difficult but far from impossible to perform, even with the technology of the time. They postulated that a particular type of Viking spearhead could be used as a makeshift tool to unzip the rib cage of the unfortunate victim quickly from the back. Such a weapon might even be depicted on a stone monument found on the Swedish island of Gotland, where a scene carved into the stone depicts something that could have been a representation of the ritual. However, the researchers also realised that even if the act was carefully performed, the victim would have died very quickly. Therefore, any attempts to reshape the ribs into the fabled wings or remove the lungs would have been performed on a corpse. That last fluttering would not have happened. The report read, "While that might make the blood eagle sound even less likely to modern ears, we also demonstrate that while mutilating corpses and carrying out rituals on dead bodies was unusual, it was not totally out of character for the warrior elite of the Viking Age." Drawing on archaeological and historical data, the research showed that the blood eagle ritual fits with what we know about how Viking Age warrior elites behaved. They had no qualms about displaying the dead bodies of humans and animals in special rituals, including during spectacular executions. The report added, "Our study specifically examined so-called deviant burials, like the skeleton of a well-dressed noblewoman who was beheaded in 10th century Birka and subsequently buried with the remains of her head tucked between her arm and torso, her missing jawbone, possibly destroyed during her decapitation, replaced by a pig's mandible. Warriors from this layer of society were also obsessed with their reputations and were willing to go to extreme lengths to protect their image." The blood eagle seems to have been a more extreme case of this sort of behaviour, conducted only in exceptional circumstances, on a captured prisoner of war who had earlier subjected the ritual doer's father or other male relative to a shameful death. In medieval sagas, some of these type of killings included victims being thrown into a pit of snakes, being burned to death in a longhouse without the chance of a fair fight, and even having their guts torn out and nailed to a post. In the sagas, the blood eagle is shown as a way for the victims' relatives to reclaim their lost honour. This is certainly the case with the execution of the character of Jarl Borg in the Vikings TV series. Contrary to established wisdom, the team argued that the blood eagle could very well have taken place in the Viking Age. It was, they concluded, physically possible, in line with broader social habits regarding execution and the treatment of corpses, and reflected what they called a cultural obsession with demonstrating your honour and prestige. They added, "What's more, its spectacular brutality would have ensured that everybody who heard about it would be keen to tell the story in all its gory details, just as we're still telling them today." New DNA evidence could rewrite established Viking history. The findings highlight that a collection of Norse lands may have been previously settled, or at least reached, by people from Britain or Ireland. The evidence from the Faroe Islands, where a language derived from Old Norse is spoken, shakes up our understanding of the history of the North Atlantic. Evidence has emerged that people reached the islands by 500 AD, around 350 years before Scandinavians arrived. This early settlement predates the adoption of long-distance sailing innovations made by the Vikings. Researchers found fragments of sheep DNA and chemical residues of sheep feces in the lake sediments on the islands of Eysturoy. These were dated using sophisticated scientific techniques. It was noted that livestock could only have reached the remote archipelago if they were taken there by humans on boats. Dr. William D'Andrea from the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, LDEO, at Columbia University in New York said, "You see, the sheep DNA and the biomarkers start all at once. It's like an on-off switch." Lead author Lorelei Curtin, who worked on the research while she was a graduate student at LDEO, said the evidence was effectively the nail in the coffin for the idea that the islands were uninhabited until the 800s. Researchers said the results provided unequivocal evidence of a human presence before the Vikings arrived in the 9th century AD. As well as this, several indirect lines of evidence suggest an earlier occupation of the Faroes by Celtic-speaking people from the British Isles. Dr. D'Andrea told BBC News, "We still really don't know who the people were and why they chose to go to the Faroe Islands, but there are lots of pieces of information that lead us to believe it is very likely there was a population of people from the British Isles." Other pointers include ancient but undated Celtic grave markers across the islands, Celtic place names, historical accounts, and DNA evidence from the people living on the islands. According to medieval texts, the early Irish navigator St Brendan set out across the Atlantic with comrades from 512 to 530 and supposedly found a land dubbed the Isle of the Blessed. Later, in 825 AD, the Irish monk Dequil wrote that some northern islands had been settled by hermits for at least 100 years. It has been speculated that these accounts refer to the Faroe Islands. DNA studies have revealed that people who live on the islands today derive most of their paternal ancestry from Scandinavians, but most of their maternal genetic material from Britons or Irish people. The pattern is repeated in Iceland and has previously been attributed to concubinage, where Norse males abducted Celtic women and transported them to their various strongholds. But it could also be the case that the islands were inhabited when they arrived. The researchers pointed out that the proportion of British or Irish ancestry is much higher in the Faroes than in Iceland. Another team of researchers had previously found cereal grains on Sandoy, which were dated between 300 and 500 years before the arrival of the Norse. Kevin Edwards from the University of Aberdeen, who was co-author of the paper, said, "The new study has produced convincing and exciting evidence of earlier occupation." He said, "Is similar evidence to be found in Iceland, where similar arguments are made for a pre-Norse presence, and for which tantalisingly similar archaeological, pollen analytical and human DNA are forthcoming?" The findings were published in the peer-reviewed journal Communications, Earth and Environment. I managed to see the wonderful film The Northman the other day. Having been looking forward to the spectacle after witnessing the vivid and ritual-heavy trailer the other week, I can attest that the film did not disappoint. On an objective level, this is a very well-made film, artistically beautiful and cleverly shot, albeit in a slightly odd aspect ratio. This has to be the most realistic portrayal of Norse pagan practice ever committed to the screen. There was, for example, an extended firelit Ulfhednar berserker ritual with a living rendition of the Odinic spear dancer from the Torslunda plates. The avenging protagonist, Amleth, was referred to as a beast wearing man flesh at one point, alluding to the wolf or dog shape-shifting of the ancient Indo-European Koryos tradition that continued into Norse society and the Germanic Mannabund war bands. There was Valkyrie iconography, the presence of Hugin and Munin, or thought and memory, Odin's ravens, who act as spies for the one-eyed god. The importance of oaths, especially blood oaths and blood feuds, punctuated this morality tale, for a morality that no longer exists in our Abrahamic-influenced world. There was a vision of the terrifying undead Draugr, as well as the always excellent Willem Dafoe chewing up the scenery as a mischievous Loki-like trickster with a deep religious purpose. Defoe's embalmed skull appears later in echoes of the beheaded Aesir god Mimir, who advised Odin. The disembodied head also called to mind that of Yorick from Shakespeare's tragedy Hamlet, upon which this blood and mud-drenched epic is loosely based. Also echoing the bard's play, there is a frisson of Oedipus complex exhibited in Amleth's reunion with his faithless mother in the desolate wastes of Iceland. The violent ancient pre-Christian sport of hurling from Ireland is represented. This is interesting as it alludes to the genetic makeup of Icelanders who trace their ancestry to Norse males and British and Irish females taken as slaves even to this day. The overall plot and payoff, which I won't spoil here, is a callback to the brutal playfulness of the poetic Edda. This rich assault on the senses also includes the sexual abandon of Slavic and Norse folklore and mythology, with all its animistic and shamanistic religious practices, which are possibly of Sami origin. This is complete with the use of mind-altering fly agaric mushrooms and the mead of poetry. There was also throat singing, which would impress the Sardaukar of the Dune film and may have been present in Norse ritual, especially if one believes the attestations of Abraham ben Jacob, a Muslim chronicler of Sephardi Jewish descent from Al-Andalus or Muslim Spain. Ben Jacob travelled to Hedeby, which is now part of the historically contested territory of Schleswig-Holstein on the now German-Danish border in the year 961. His original account is lost, but a few translations, which may or may not be accurate, paint a fascinating, if slightly comic picture. One read, "Never did I hear singing fouler than that of these people. It is a rumbling emanating from their throats, similar to that of a dog, but even more bestial." The realism of the grimly dark mead halls and fiery boat burials and human and horse sacrifice is a bloody feast for the eyes. There was also higher prophecy in the form of visions of Yggdrasil and hanging sacrifice on the world tree. In short, it was a pulsating tour de force, a visual and audible nightmare of a brutish and short lifetime of duty, revenge, violence, and longed-for ascent to Valhalla. If you want to witness what Norse society and religion was probably like, then this film is a must. That's it for this video. Don't forget to like, share, and most importantly subscribe. And thank you for watching.